Hi, everyone. How are you all doing? Good evening. Welcome to Philadelphia. I am super excited to spend the next few minutes with you all here at Inforce 2025. Please raise your hand if you've heard of Agentic AI. I'm sure you've all have heard a little bit about it so far, right? So for this session, in the next few minutes, we're really going to dive into how we can use AWS to mitigate some of the threats that we have recognized with tool-based systems. So this will be our agenda for the next few minutes. I want to start by recognizing a few customer challenges that we've noticed when implementing agentic AI systems. We'll review a recommended solution and best practices for mitigating some threats. We'll review a solution architecture behind the solution. We'll walk through a demo of the solution, and we'll review the outcome as well and takeaways, and then we'll talk about next steps for you all. So, Agentic AI. Here, we're talking about enhancing the capabilities of large language models. We're talking about autonomous systems that can make decisions and take actions to perform tasks without human intervention. So there's three key threats that I want to recognize to you today. The first being tool misuse. So this is the idea that attackers can manipulate agents to actually misuse their tools. The second threat I want to recognize for you today is privilege compromise. So the idea that attackers can actually exploit weaknesses in privilege management. And then lastly, repudiation and traceability. So the fact that maybe these agents can actually reject an idea that is given to them, or these actions of agents are difficult to trace and log. And of course, security is top priority at AWS. So let's dive into how we can use AWS services to help defend against these threats. I first want to introduce to you 6 key services, the first being API Gateway. So this is our service that helps you securely build and deploy APIs on AWS. The way we'll be seeing this used here is request authorization through the usage plan capability of API Gateway. Secondly, we have IAM, or Identity and Access Management Service. So this is what we'll be using for permission management for both services and users. Thirdly, we have Lambda, which is our serverless compute service. And then fourthly, Amazon Bedrock, the easiest way to create scalable generative AI applications. In particular, we're going to be looking at Bedrock guardrails. So this is the feature of Bedrock that allows us to configure safeguards in the interest of responsible AI for both input and output validation. And then lastly, we talked about untraceability being a concern and a challenge customers are facing. So of course, we'll dive into CloudWatch and CloudTrail for logging and monitoring. This is our architecture we'll be taking a look at. So we're going to be taking a look at a sample application starting here on the left. So this could be any application that invokes an agent. It could be front-end or back-end. So our app invokes an agent, and then API Gateway allows us for the application to interface with our infrastructure. And then here, we're using AWS Lambda as an orchestration. So it's actually handling the incoming prompt or query from the user that's coming through API Gateway. And then it's sending it to, first, Bedrock guardrails. So guardrail is actually going to do some content validation for both input and output. And then it sends that request to the agent in Bedrock. That agent has access to a Lambda function that actually executes a tool. And then in this context of the demo, we'll see it's actually parsing the internet and has connectivity. All along, we're using AWS IAM to give these services least privileged access to each other to perform these actions. And then CloudTrail and CloudWatch for visibility. Now we're going to dive into the demo. So this is a sample application here. We're going to want to start by asking it, just what are some new features or new announcements from AWS? The key difference I want to point out to you here is how it's acting differently than how a traditional AI application would. So a traditional app wouldn't be able to give us the current or correct information because it doesn't have internet connectivity. But because this application is agentic, it's actually going out and parsing the internet to retrieve the answers for us. And we can actually validate this by going to the website itself and seeing that it's giving us the most up-to-date information. So now that we see how our sample application works, let's go and dive into the back end and see how this workflow works. So first, the request comes in through API Gateway. How we're using API Gateway to protect our application is via the usage plan. You can think of the usage plan as a contract between yourself as the API provider and your client or user as the API consumer. So usage plans allow us to set limit rates. Here we have 10 requests per second, and actually associate an API key. So every request being made to the API is able to be uniquely identified. So now we are diving into our Lambda function. So our Lambda function is doing two different things. It's doing some input validation. Here, for example, the query length max, some IP address logging. And then it's actually sending this request to our Bedrock agent. So now we're here in Bedrock. Remember, we talked about guardrails. So these are safeguards that are put in place, fully managed, for both input and output validation. So we have that first line of defense with Lambda. Guardrails are second line of defense, specifically a prompt injection attack. We're using the prompt injection guardrail. So let's say we're pretending we're to be a malicious actor. We want to tell the agent to misuse its tool access. And our guardrail was able to effectively block against that attack. And remember, we talked about IAM. So IAM is what is allowing us to actually restrict the access that the agent has to begin with. So if we dive into the IAM policy that's attached to this agent, we see that it only has limited actions. For example, being able to apply the guardrail, invoke the model, and the inference profile, for example. And then lastly, the Lambda function. If you notice, the Lambda function is actually the execution tool. So remember, our first one was what orchestrates the entire workflow and does some content validation. Our second Lambda function here is actually built to allow the agent to go parse the internet. So that's our execution Lambda. And our third challenge we talked about was traceability. So this is where we really want to dive into CloudWatch and CloudTrail for monitoring. We're going to navigate to a few CloudWatch logs here. We're using CloudTrail to track API activity here and for our two Lambda functions as well. So it's not just for API Gateway and the calls made to the API that we created, or excuse me, within the account, but also for the ones that we created for the API. And then in CloudWatch, we have some dashboards here as well. We can take a look at things like API Gateway latency, the requests coming in, Lambda invocations as well, giving us full visibility and monitoring into our Agentic AI application. We can even set alarms with CloudWatch. So say there was to be a number of server-side errors here, we could set an action there. For example, we can get a notification or even have it set to do remediation actions. So this concludes our demo for today. Let's review the outcome that we saw just now. So we were able to address those three challenges our customers are seeing by creating a serverless and secure Agentic AI workflow using Lambda. And then we saw inputs and outputs being validated. So we saw that first line of defense with our orchestration Lambda function. When that query came in, it was checking for the query length. It was checking for where the IP address was being called from. And then with our Bedrock guardrail for prompt injection, it was also checking the input, and on top of that, the output that the model was giving from the agent. Lastly, we were following best practices with access management, with identity access management and API gateway with that usage plan we saw here. And most importantly, to address untraceability challenges, we use CloudWatch and CloudTrail to make sure that each step is traced and logged. From the very first moment that that query is sent to our application to the final output from our agent. I want to share some resources for you all on getting started with securing Agentic AI applications. On the left, we do have a workshop available if you want to get some hands-on experience, step-by-step walking through Bedrock agents. And then on the right, we have some guidance built by AWS solutions architects when it comes to building Agentic AI applications, some design patterns and things you should consider. I really hope you enjoyed this session. Please go ahead and make sure to fill out the survey and see how we can improve. If you have any questions or want to continue the conversation, let me know. I'll be hanging around over here by the theater. Thank you so much and have a great night.